Muy buenos días a todas y todos y muchas gracias por acompañarnos durante esta jornada. Mi nombre es Fabricio Rodríguez, trabajo para el clúster de datos y gobierno digital del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo y tendré el agrado de acompañarlos durante los distintos momentos de esta presentación de la guía para el diseño de colaboraciones de datos. Antes de comenzar, quisiera brindar algunas instrucciones logísticas para el desarrollo de este evento. Primero, este webinar se llevará a cabo en español e inglés, para lo cual tenemos disponible interpretación simultánea en los dos idiomas. Para cambiar de idioma, por favor, seleccione el icono del mundo ubicado en la parte inferior de la pantalla y elige el idioma de su preferencia. Hello everyone, this event will be held in English and Spanish with simultaneous interpretation provided. To access it, please select your preferred language by clicking on the gloves icon located at the bottom of the screen. Thank you very much. Además, se podrán realizar preguntas sobre la guía a lo largo del programa. Para ello, les invitamos a escribirlas en la sección de Q&A que está disponible para el efecto. Al escribir su pregunta, por favor, les pedimos colocar su nombre y a quién iría dirigida esta. El equipo estará gustoso de atenderlas a lo largo de la agenda. Para acceder a la guía para el diseño de colaboraciones de datos, ustedes podrán escanear el código QR que aparecerá en los distintos momentos de esta sesión o podrán hacerlo también a través del enlace que se encuentra en el chat de este evento. Finalmente, les agradecemos a todas y todos mantener sus micrófonos silenciados mientras los participantes intervienen. Dicho esto, quiero extender un agradecimiento especial por la participación a las y los funcionarios de las distintas agencias de América Latina y el Caribe que nos acompañan en este momento. Y sin más preámbulos, para iniciar, quiero brindar la palabra a Roberto de Michele, jefe de la División de Innovación para Servir al Ciudadano del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, quien además ha sido el autor del prólogo de la publicación que hoy nos convoca. Roberto, muchas gracias por acompañarnos y bienvenido.
Gracias a ti, Fabricio. Buenos días a todas y a todos. Antes de que se unieran todos a esta conversación, charlaba con los autores de la guía y los felicitaba por hacer realmente un trabajo excepcional en traer a la mesa un tema muy complejo, nuevo, absolutamente innovador en muchas situaciones y creo que han hecho un muy buen trabajo en hacer una guía que es práctica. Y quiero resaltar solamente dos o tres temas antes de pasar a la parte más entretenida de esta conversación que van a ser los paneles y las discusiones. Cuando ustedes accedan a la guía, van a seguramente identificar al menos los siguientes temas. Vivimos en una situación en la cual los datos nos rodean, están realmente son ubicuos, están en todas partes y en todos lados. Nosotros producimos datos, otros producen datos sobre nosotros. Muchas veces quienes producen estos datos son entidades públicas, pero muchas veces son entidades privadas. Es un mundo en el cual esos datos están a disposición de múltiples fuentes y de múltiples actores. Son, por lo tanto, por una parte, un activo y por otro lado también son un instrumento. Y como todo activo y como todo instrumento, tienen valor y pueden ser utilizados de distintas maneras. Tienen un valor que hay que guardar, que hay que cuidar, y son un instrumento que puede generar externalidades muy positivas, pero también tiene riesgos. Y estas externalidades positivas pueden ayudar a que nuestra vida sea mejor, que nuestras decisiones sean más informadas, que podamos ejercer mejor nuestros derechos, que podamos desarrollarnos, que podamos interactuar mejor con nuestros pares. Al mismo tiempo, hay riesgos que personas o grupos no escrupulosos utilicen esos mismos datos de una forma tal que nos pueda incomodar, molestar o incluso hasta perjudicar. Por lo tanto, este es un tema central en los tiempos en que vivimos. Y como no es fácil llegar a una solución sobre qué se debe hacer, creo que el enfoque que esta publicación le da al tema, y en eso quiero fundamentalmente agradecer la posibilidad de que hayamos hecho una alianza tan importante y tan interesante con GovLab para esta publicación es que trabajemos juntos para resolver estas tensiones, que enfrentemos este desafío de una manera colaborativa. Y esto justamente es el objetivo de la publicación. Ofrecerles a ustedes, a los que son funcionarios públicos, a las personas que hacen política pública, a los académicos, a los que usan datos, una guía, una manera de administrar y gestionar este proceso colaborativamente, para que podamos entre todos construir un espacio más creativo, más constructivo y más valioso en la administración de estos datos. Sin más, como lo he hecho yo al menos un par de veces, los invito a leer este magnífico documento. Les agradezco que estén presentes aquí y estoy seguro que van a tener una conversación muy, pero muy útil. Un tema adicional antes de terminar, que lo conversábamos con Natalia. Esta guía va a ser tan buena como el uso y la aplicación que se le dé. Entonces los invito a que una vez que se apaguen los micrófonos y las cámaras de esta discusión, usen esa guía, conversen con nosotros, nos digan cómo les ha ido en la aplicación de la guía. Y de esa manera vamos a hacer del documento un producto activo, un producto que efectivamente pueda resolver estos dilemas y pueda proteger los datos que son de todos. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a ti, Roberto, por tu intervención. Y ya lo decía, este ejercicio fue posible también gracias al Laboratorio de Gobierno de la Universidad de Nueva York, de GovLab en NYU, de quien en este momento nos acompaña Stefan Verhulst, cofundador y jefe de investigación de este laboratorio, que será también el encargado de hacer la presentación de esta guía. Good morning, Stefan. Thank you for joining, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, Fabricio. Thanks for having me. And so I'm delighted to, and thanks also, Roberto, for the kind words and for the words that matter with regard to a guide is only as good as it is being implemented and used. But before we go there, I'm delighted to give a brief introduction on what the guide is all about. What are its key contents? Why have we drafted the guide? But also, what are some of the key components that we have suggested could build a foundation, an environment for data collaboratives. And so let me quickly share my screen. And I do have to say, it is a bit of a task because it's a 80+ guide and I have about 10 minutes to introduce it. So I will be quick, but obviously there will be time for Q&A. And obviously, this is meant to be a teaser, not to just give you all the content yet, with the hope that you subsequently will actually go and look at the guide as well. So what are we talking about today? And I hope this will work. It's really a guide that seeks to facilitate data flows through data collaboratives. And I will explain a little bit in a second what we mean by data collaboratives, but also what we mean by data flows, especially from the perspective of matching demand and supply of data in society. And I'm not here by myself. I'm here also joined by Natalia Gonzalez Alarcón, who is the co-author of the guide and who also will help us with moderating the panel following this guide, because we also brought a tremendous group of leaders and experienced data collaborators to the table as well. So the guide starts, and from our point of view, a lot of the work we do at GovLab starts from the sheer observation that digitalization has led to datafication. And to a large extent, we didn't really realize early days when we were focusing on digital transformation that one of the key assets that digitalization generates is actually data. So we have a lot more data each time when there is a digital transaction, each time when an organization or a country moves into digital transformation. That means that we actually have a new data infrastructure as the result of digitalization. We have trails that are the result of digital transaction. Each time when you make a call, there is a digital data point that is being created, and so on. So we have an increase in volume of the data. We also have an increase in variety. We have different types of data that complements traditional data sources, such as surveys, for instance. But now we have cell phone data, we have mobility data, we have retail data that can be used for generating insight in how society works. But we also have an increase in and a change in veracity and velocity, by which I mean is that the quality and quite often the time that is comprised in the data is of a different character. It's almost like we can now follow in real time what happens in society as well. Now, this obviously has both generated a buzz, which is quite often under the rubric of big data, but it also has created challenges. And a lot of the focus that we've had the last few years is really about how do we prevent misuse of the data that is being generated? How do we make sure that the data that has been generated as a result of generalization is not being abused? Now, this obviously is a very important aspect, but from our point of view, there's another important aspect that we cannot forget, because if we are solely focused on preventing misuse, we are actually preventing and also preventing misuses from happening from the data by focusing on how do we reuse the data. And the real challenge that we seek to address today in this guide is not just focusing on preventing misuse, but is also focusing on how do we make sure that this increased supply of data matches the increased demand for data in society as well. And this is what we call data flows, which is really about where the supply is being matched with the demand that has increased, both in terms of demand from government, for instance, to have access to data, but also demand from society at large in order to become more data-driven in their decision-making, but also, of course, the demand for business as such. And so from our point of view, there are a whole range of flows that one needs to consider and that needs to be enabled in order to really enable a data-driven society in a responsible way. And those data flows, anyway, as you can see, can be identified according to a matrix where we have, on the one hand, the data holders, and that could be government as a data holder, it could be business as a data holder, or it could be society and individuals, or even researchers, for instance, as data holders. And then on the other side, we have the ones that need data in order to improve their mission, especially from a government. How do you build better public services if you don't have access to data? But also, of course, want to generate economic well-being and generate economic resiliency. That means that businesses need to have data that quite often is already collected in a way that is responsible as well. And so we see those plethora of flows that need to be established, G2B, B2G, G2G, in order to really make sure that the data flows serve society as well. Now, the real challenge has been that we quite often have a challenge in actually enabling those data flows. And I will talk about that in a second also, that this could be and is quite often a policy challenge, but it's also a challenge because we don't have an operational model that really allows for those flows to happen. Because in most cases, those data cannot be made fully open, right? And so we really have to start thinking about how do we manage the spectrum of openness of data in order to accelerate the flow of data. And one vehicle for doing that is by setting up data collaboratives, which are new kind of public-private or private-private or private people partnerships in order to facilitate the flow from the supply side of data to the demand side of the data, to really match demand and supply by focusing on access to the demand, access to the supply, in order to reuse it as well. Now, at GovLab, and we are an action research center focusing on how do we transform the way we make decisions, we have, for the last few years, experimented with a whole range of data collaboratives in order to accelerate the data flows that can matter in society. And one of the big messages from that, and one of the big learnings from all our work on data collaboratives, is that there is no one way to facilitate data flows. There are a variety of ways in which you can establish data collaboratives across a spectrum, as I mentioned, of openness of data. On the one hand, you can have public interfaces where data can freely, quite often, but in other cases, quite often under certain conditions, can be downloaded for reuse. And on the other hand, we have intelligence generation and intelligence sharing where no data is being shared, but the intelligence is being shared from the data as well. And in between, we have a whole range of models, which we still call data collaboratives, because it's still a partnership between the supply and the demand of data to a large extent. Now, what we have tried to do through this guide is by really thinking about what are the building blocks that allows for data collaboratives to be created so that the data flows can be accelerated in society in a way that benefits society, in a way that benefits the different stakeholders that we have identified that needs to become more data-driven as well. And so by thinking about what are the building blocks for data collaboratives, we make a distinction between two layers and two levels. On the top level, we really start thinking about what's the enabling environment that needs to be in place within a country, within a city, or even within an organization that would allow for data collaboratives to be created in a systematic, sustainable, and responsible way. And then at the other layer, we then start looking into, well, if you want to develop a data collaborative, what are the steps that needs to be in place? What's the sequence for actually setting up a concrete data collaborative? And so we have the enabling ecosystem that we focused on, and we have also focused on, well, if you then actually want to develop a data collaborative, what are some of the steps that needs to be taken into account? I briefly, given the fact that I only have a few minutes today to really go through the guide, I will briefly touch on a few of the building blocks that we believe can enable countries, cities, and organizations to become more ready as it relates to unlocking data flows through data collaboratives. And the first kind of layer, as I mentioned, is really the kind of meta macro layer where we need to start focusing on what needs to be in place for data collaboratives to be established at kind of the environmental, the kind of policy layer. And so we've identified 7 kind of building blocks that at a minimum need to be considered if you want to facilitate data flows. The first one is really that a country, a city, or an organization needs to start thinking about what are the principles that will guide us in actually establishing data flows. Without that kind of North Star, it's very hard to evaluate what decisions need to be made and how one shall make decisions vis-a-vis those kinds of data collaboratives. And so it's really important to start thinking about what are the current principles that guide data in your society today, and are they inducive for actually data collaboratives for data flows? Because what we have seen, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of the principles focus on preventing misuse, which is still very important, but what about accelerating use in the public interest? And how can we do this? By focusing on social impact principles as it relates to data as well. In addition to that, of course, one needs to have some kind of a regulatory governance framework in place that allows for organizations to actually establish data collaboratives. Quite often, there are rules and regulations and governance frameworks that have been focusing on limiting quite often the data flow in order to protect indeed public interest subjects. But we also need to start thinking, well, do we actually need to complement those regulatory frameworks that then allow for data to be made available, and that can then unlock data flows in a way that benefits society as well? And so what we've seen, for instance, in many regions, just think about, for instance, Europe, where they initially started with, for instance, the GDPR as kind of the regulatory framework to govern data, they now have also realized that they need to complement that framework with additional regulations to actually facilitate data flows, to make sure that organizations feel comfortable and secure and regulatory secure to actually provide access to data as well. The third element is that none of this will happen without a human infrastructure, which means that we actually need to invest in new professions and new functions, which we call data stewards. And so we need to actually invest in competencies to steward data, not just to protect data, but to steward data in a way that allows for data to be made accessible in a responsible way so that that can be used for other purposes that are publicly serve the public interest. The fourth element is that obviously, in addition to the governance infrastructure and the human infrastructure, we also have to invest in the tech infrastructure. And more importantly, we also have to invest in standards. Now, I list this as number 4 because quite often people start thinking immediately about the tech infrastructure. But from our point of view, tech is very important, but governance is equally, and the human infrastructure is equally important. And as it relates to the tech infrastructure, here there's a lot of innovation that is happening recently that actually can allow data to flow in a privacy-enhancing manner. And so it's not just about storage, it's also about, for instance, privacy-enhancing technologies that can enable access to data in a way that is secure. We also need to think about change management, because this is really about changing the culture of decision-making, whether it's within government, within the private sector, and within society at large. And so this is also a key component in how you build an enabling environment where you actually nurture a data-driven society, which also means that it is a society that is driven by questions that data can answer. It's not just about the data, but it's also about a culture of what are the questions that we need to answer with data in order to, for instance, advance societal objectives. And then we need ways to make decisions, right? Governance processes, but that also means that we need ways to deal with disputes or ways to deal with complaints. And so we need a dispute resolution process, because things will inevitably sometimes go wrong. And so what is then the process, for instance, to deal with some of the challenges, some of the disputes that might arise between parties of a data collaborative? And so we need to invest in those kind of governance processes as well. And then last but not least, because we are talking about reusing data for other purposes than initially collected, it also means that we actually need to reestablish the social license for reusing data. Because typically, in most jurisdictions, data is being collected through consent. And consent typically only covers the initial purpose for which it was collected. So we need to complement that with what we call a social license. What are communities' interests? What do they prefer? What does society want the data to be reused for, so that it complements the kind of individual consent and allows for actually the data holder to understand what is socially acceptable as it relates to reuse as well. So these are the 7 elements that enable an environment where data collaboration can actually flourish, where data flows can be facilitated in a more systematic, sustainable, and responsible way. And then we didn't stop there. We also said, well, if you have then the environment, how do you actually then set up a data collaborative? And so here, very quickly, based upon our experience of setting up data collaboratives ourselves, we basically have distilled it down through kind of 5 key steps that need to be taken into account. And you will see at each of those steps, you require some kind of data stewardship kind of components and capabilities. The first one is, of course, that you really need to focus on what's the purpose for which you need data, because you cannot, and many data initiatives have failed without having a clear purpose, a clear problem that you seek to inform through the data. And that means that you need to spend a lot of time on actually problem definition, but more importantly, really thinking about what is the question that matters for which we need data, because without that kind of understanding what is the question, you also don't understand what's the minimum viable data. Now, then obviously you need to go to the supply. I need to start thinking about, if that's the question, what is the data that is needed? Who has the data at the moment? And how can I unlock that data in a way that is responsible, in a way that actually is systematic, but also in a way that provides incentives for the data holder. And so it's also about building the business case quite often, whether it's a government or private sector, for providing access to the data. And then it's about matching demand and supply, which means that we really need to start focusing then on what data collaborative is fit for purpose, because it's not about coming up with one kind of data collaborative that you believe, anyway, looks good and anyway, you want to establish. It's really about thinking about what's the operational model in order to unlock the data, what's the governance model to unlock the data, and what are then the technical requirements that are needed in order to actually provide access to the data, to transfer the data in a privacy-enhanced way, and to subsequently analyze and unlock its value. And then, of course, that's the matching. And then, of course, we really need to start thinking about the impact, because data has no value unless it actually is used, right? Unless the insight is being used to meet a particular kind of problem. And so here the question is then, who needs the insight? How is the insight going to be used? And how do we make sure that it actually provides social impact? So all of this, and I realize this has been kind of a rush to make sure that we actually hear from our distinctive panelists as well. But all of this is in our guide. And in order to make it more user-friendly, we also have translated that into canvases or templates that can be used, whether you're a decision maker, a policy maker, to really start thinking about what is the ecosystem for data collaboration in my country, and are there certain areas that need to be invested in, such as, for instance, new governance frameworks or decision processes that are currently not in place that need to be established. And we also have a guide for anyone who wants to develop a data collaborative together with other parties on what it takes. So it's not just about the technology, it's really about thinking about the problem and then thinking about what is fit for purpose as well. So with that, I will stop here. And as I mentioned, this is anyway a rough and quick summary of what's in the guide. And we do hope that this guide will be meaningful, both in terms of creating an enabling environment for data collaboration and for data flows, but also a practical guide if you actually want to make your hands dirty and develop data collaboratives as well. With that, over to you, Fabrizio.
Muchísimas gracias, Estefan. Sin duda es un reto hacer una presentación tan resumida de una herramienta tan completa, tan didáctica como lo mencionaba al principio Roberto, y que aporta no solo las condiciones habilitantes para la generación de estos mecanismos del fomento de los flujos de los datos, sino una metodología aterrizada que permite a los gobiernos y a los distintos actores transitar hacia la generación de, en este caso, las colaboraciones de datos. Muchas gracias de nuevo, Estefan, por esta presentación y por haber sido en conjunto con Uma Calcari y Natalia González los artífices de la guía que esta mañana nos convoca. Antes de continuar, quiero invitarlos a explorar la guía de la que estamos hablando a través del código QR que encontrarán en el transcurso de las diferentes presentaciones de estas sesiones, o a través del link que se ha dejado en la sección del chat de este webinar. También agradecer a los más de 150 participantes que tenemos en este momento conectados, para entonces dar la bienvenida a nuestros invitados que serán parte del panel que para esta jornada hemos preparado. El día de hoy nos acompañan Diana Rodríguez, secretaria de la Mujer de la Alcaldía de Bogotá, Alberto Palomo, que es Chief de la Oficina del Dato de la Secretaría de Estado de Digitalización e Inteligencia Artificial de España, Fraser McDonald, subdirector del Data for Children Collaborative at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, y Julia Díaz, que es Data Partnership Manager del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Bueno, para arrancar con esta jornada de presentaciones, quiero iniciar con Diana Rodríguez. Diana es doctora en Sociología de Northwestern University, además es abogada y economista de la Universidad de los Andes de Colombia. Diana fue nombrada secretaria de la Mujer de la Alcaldía de Bogotá en enero del 2020 y ha dedicado su vida al estudio y la defensa de los derechos humanos. Como subdirectora e investigadora del Centro de Estudios de Derecho, Justicia y Sociedad, se ha enfocado en temas de participación ciudadana, desplazamiento forzado, acceso a la salud y política ambiental. Diana, es un honor contar con tu presencia esta mañana. Estamos muy contentos de escuchar qué está haciendo la Alcaldía de Bogotá en materia de colaboraciones de datos, particularmente desde la Secretaría de la Mujer que tú diriges. Bienvenida.
Gracias, Fabricio, and I'll be switching to English, right?
It's perfect, as you prefer.
It's all right? Okay, great, because I understand it was in English. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And Nati, if we please could show my screen and presentation. So what are we doing in Colombia, in Bogotá specifically, in Colombia's capital city, with regard to data collaborative? We have a wonderful data collaborative with GovLab and Data2X and many of partners that have joined during the different phases on gender, care, and mobility. And what do I mean by a collaborative on gender, care, and mobility? I refer to care are those basic that job which sustain lives, and which means cooking, cleaning, taking care of children, of people with disabilities, and of the elderly that require care. And that care burden has been placed on women as a result of the sexual division of labor. Because of that, women are trapped in monetary poverty and time poverty. And they devote their time to moving around the city all over the place and trying to address all those high care demands. And so Bogotá designed care blocks. Care blocks, and our data collaborative is focused on the access to these care blocks in Bogotá. So care blocks are physical areas in the city, like the one you see right there in the picture, that bring together services for caregivers, care receivers, and men and their families. For caregivers, we offer them those services they've left aside because of the care burden. We offer them the possibility of finishing high school, learning how to ride a bike, learning how to use a computer, having free psychological and legal aid. Everything they've put on pause because of that care burden, which has trapped them in time poverty. At the same time, we take care of their children, the people with disabilities, and the elderly they care for. And we offer cultural transformation workshops for men and their families because we can all learn to care. All that is offered in one area, in a care block, in a few blocks all together, to guarantee that caregivers can actually access those care blocks. But that's where the question arises. What influences access to care blocks? How are people accessing care blocks? Are they accessing care blocks in the way we planned? What are the obstacles? Those were the lingering questions, and that's where the data collaborative emerged. Next. And so our faces, what do we do here? What are the faces of our mission? Our mission to understand access to care blocks. For our first phase was exploring, defining the problem, finding the right questions, and finding and thinking what is the traditional and non-traditional data that we can use. Our second phase was holding lab sessions or studios in which we gathered the experts that from different walks of life and the world of care and transportation and data could help us think how to design how to address this question. And our third phase was we decided to implement some pilot actions immediately to try to collect the data to address this question. Next. So what were the steps to defining the mission and the problem? The first was we had our key initial partners, GovLab and Data2X, which called us the Secretary for Women Affairs, and I was extremely honored to receive their invitation for Data Collaborative on this poignant problem. Then we said, okay, what are the questions that can address the relationship between urban mobility and care block attendance? What matters? What is an actual question we can tap into? What data sets exist? That's another question we had to ask ourselves. What is there? What can be used to gather data, but data sets and data that was not only the one that's always used by the government sector, but what is the non-traditional data that's out there? Also, how do we match the demand and supply of data? Those were all the steps and questions we went into. And then our next step was gathering the actors. Who needs to sit at the table if we really want to address this? Question on how do we access care blocks? Next. So then we held our lab sessions, and we held our lab sessions. We've held 3 studios or sessions. They've been co-hosted by GovLab Data2X and the Secretary for Women Affairs. And the first question was, okay, who needs to sit at these lab sessions? Who are those data holders? Which is extremely important to identify, because especially in the government sector, we tend to look one way. What is the data available to us? What is that we already either collect ourselves or that we easily have access to? But what other things are out there that have much better data that we might have? For instance, Telefónica or Transmilenio, the public bus system, and so forth. And so who were the data holders that had to sit at the table? Then we held small conversations, or like conversations in small groups with groups of experts in those fields, trying to really tailor what was needed. And then we had to define what the data holders could offer, what data users needed, and how other stakeholders could contribute to this. And then came the task of narrowing down questions to inform our research problem. And so we boiled it down to what forms of transportation are used to access care blocks, and what difficulties do they find? Like, really, how are people accessing care blocks, and ultimately, what barriers are they encountering? Next. We held, and so we held, first, let's go back to the previous one, I'm sorry. Let me tell you a little bit more about the type of studios and who was there, because I think that matters in terms of thinking who needs to sit at the table. So for instance, we had Leo Ferrez, from a fellow of Telefónica, or Federico Mesa from Systematica, Robin Chase, an international expert on mobility, Timothy Papandreou, right, another expert on mobility, former secretaries of transportation in Bogota, like Nicolás Estupiñán and Felipe Ramírez. I think it mattered having different perspectives, different parts of the world, not only having a knowledge of Bogota, but not only. We had Marianelli Velázquez, the regional manager of transportation at C40. We had Lynn Skoll from the Inter-American Development Bank. So we had, as you can see, from different backgrounds. Then our second studio focus, that one went, I think that's important to know what can happen in those data collaboratives, is the question on access flourished from, it grew very much. We had to go from hearing a lot of people to then narrowing it back down. At first, I'll be honest, I was a bit afraid that, yikes, we're going in very different directions, but I would include it in that this is normal in those collaborative phases, in that one core question can expand into multiple questions, especially when you're talking about access to something. People talked about the importance of communication strategies and so forth. And then we narrowed it back down to focusing on mobility. And so that second studio focused on concrete and actionable steps to create the data collaborative and achieve that outcome on access. And then Studio 3, what it did was it scoped out the different data sources we had identified and what specific data sources we needed to unlock. But at the same time, next slide, please. We decided to do some pilot studies, because we thought that even the collaborative would benefit more if we put something in action. Right? And if we started to collect some form of data and test the questions we thought were important to answer the broader question. So we did a pilot of a data collection tool with care block users and non-users with the Bogota Innovation Lab. And so we originally did this in 3 care blocks, but we've expanded the pilot to 13 care blocks. We were also testing if we would have the social license with communities. Would users of the care blocks be willing to speak about how they access, what are their limitations, what matters at the moment of making the decision in terms of mobility to access care blocks? So that piloting, that was very important to test the degree of social license that we could count on. We've had 507 responses regarding to mobility and access to care block questions. So what we realized was that yes, and it covers 45 variables. We've started this since August 1st. So all this to say that what we were testing was a unique we were registering users to care blocks through WhatsApp. We were creating a personalized ID card with an avatar. You can see a small picture of it right there. And what we wanted to know was, okay, who were the people that were accessing the care blocks and how were they accessing it? And then we've also had conversations with Telefónica talking about a potential collaboration about GPS data. And we were able, from this collaborative, to quickly ask the Secretary of Mobility to adapt the future mobility survey of Bogota to include gender and care questions related to gender in general, but also to care specifically and the access to care blocks. And what I believe is valuable at this point is the fact that, and the lesson from this, I think, of the potential of data collaboratives is it gets everybody thinking, it gets everyone at the table, it forces us to think outside the box, it brings in new, both ideas of new questions, but also new data sources, new colleagues, new partners, and at the same time, I think is a good practice to start implementing things of what comes out of those lab sessions or studios, implement it quickly to be able to be testing if what you're coming up with in the data collaborative is applicable or will indeed happen, like having a social license. And I would leave it there. Oh, quickly, very quickly. Yes, I don't know if I have time. I think I'm running out of time. But just to give you an idea of what came out of this is, for example, we learned that most people, 80%, were coming to care blocks by foot, just 12% by bus, 5% by bicycle, and very few by car. What were the difficulties that were found? And we found, okay, money. So maybe they're walking because they don't have money for the bus. There also came the issue of insecurity and that the times and moments in which they were walking to the care blocks, and so forth, different aspects like having a disability, and so the appropriate infrastructure to access and so forth. So this gives you an idea, and the good thing about this is we can quickly implement it. So jointly finding a problem and answering the question simultaneously is absolutely key to being able, and there you can see some of the pictures of how the app was used, how the women were given and the users were given their ID. That's a little bit to take you into one of those care blocks and the pilot studies as I wrap up my conversation. Thank you.
No, muchas gracias a ti, Diana. Es realmente interesante escuchar y aprender cómo desde la perspectiva de un gobierno subnacional, en este caso, a través del fomento de los flujos y del uso y la reutilización de datos, se permiten generar en definitiva mejores políticas públicas que afectan la calidad de vida de nuestros ciudadanos. Muchas gracias por tu presentación, realmente muy enriquecedor conocer la experiencia de la Secretaría de la Mujer de la ciudad de Bogotá. Ahora quisiera continuar con Alberto Palomo, que es Chief Data Officer del Gobierno de España. Alberto estudió física en el departamento de Stephen Hopkins en Cambridge y se doctoró en supergravedad en el CSIC de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Trabajó para el Laboratorio de Innovación de Huawei en Toronto, Canadá, modelizando la aceleración de redes neuronales. Actualmente ostenta la presidencia del Consejo Asesor Gubernamental de Gaia-X Europa, que armoniza los programas de políticas públicas europeas de datos con las actividades industriales de la Unión, acomodando las nuevas regulaciones para lograr una transformación digital que capitalice la nueva economía del dato de extraordinario valor añadido. Alberto, qué suerte contar contigo en esta presentación. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Queremos escuchar de ti sobre la estrategia de datos de la Unión Europea a través de espacios de datos y los desafíos de gobernanza que de allí se derivan. Bienvenido.
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Me escucháis bien, verdad?
Te escucho bien, sí.
If you don't mind, I'll switch to English because I prepared the presentation in English, and so there's going to be translation anyway. First of all, thanks to the Inter-American Development Bank for inviting us here in Spain. Like you said, I'm the Chief Data Officer of the government. It's a new position that was created roughly 3 years ago, and report to the head of digital for the country, so the Secretary of State for Digitalization and AI. So I wanted to, like you said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the European data strategy. I don't want to get into the weeds of that because obviously that is a European Commission document that was approved by the Parliament as well. But the purpose of our office is really to try to create this strategy in practice, and so we do that by this instrument of data spaces, but clearly, and as Stefan mentioned before, very quickly you get into the aspects of governance. So if you can go to the next slide. Here I'm going to talk about what is it that the Oficina del Dato, the National Data Office in Spain, was created, because we don't actually hold data. We weren't really created to manage data. There's a lot of public entities and private organizations that are very good at that. What we thought, or what my bosses thought was missing, was sort of a transversal or horizontal capabilities to do so in a harmonized way, because that's really where you can foster the power of common data. And so our objective really is to establish a general framework, a country-wide framework, but also European in some ways, because we feed a lot from the European strategy, but also, as you said, I'm currently chairing the Governmental Advisory Board to Gaia-X, and it's all about sovereign data sharing. And so what we really want to do is to drive both the public administration in Spain, but very noticeably as well, the private industry initiatives, And we do that by considering not only technological aspects, but also public interventions, architectural aspects, and sort of incentives, both from the business and from the public administration side. And really the purpose of establishing this framework is to be able to, first of all, generate value from data. We really are trying to push for the single data market in Europe. Obviously, it has to be done by coordinating efforts at both national and European scale, potentially internationally as well. That's not really the scope at the moment, but of course, once it's deployed and more practical, it might take that considerations as well. And two key aspects are, well, first of all, is the element of data sharing. It's become very, very noticeable, and thus this guide on data collaboratives, but it has to be done with sovereignty. This is a key element, and there's a lot of definitions of sovereignty when it comes to the digital world and the data world, because some people talk about microelectronics, detail sovereignty, but here I'm specifically talking about data sovereignty. It's the ability to control what is happening with your data, and for that purpose, from a architectural or technological point of view, we really leverage a lot both the organizational sort of structures of the Data Space Business Alliance, which is an alliance that is two years old, sort of trying to, within Europe, trying to harmonize the efforts of various initiatives that have been both with private and public money happening in Europe, but also technical architectures like the one that Gaia-X does, And so the idea is not necessarily to simply and I say simply with a quote, this is actually quite difficult. It's not just about sharing data resources, as in data sets, but also algorithms, models, ontologies, and potentially infrastructure services as well. And this is the whole power of those of you that might be familiar with Gaia-X. Gaia-X was branded as the European cloud. It's not really a cloud service. It's a cloud model to be able to provide data services, cloud-based data services in a harmonized way. And obviously, the initiative is so, or the intention is so broad that it's not, we don't expect it to accomplish it from the public perspective, but rather building these collaborative bridges, and sort of really the vision, the medium and long-term vision is to transform data transformation, really to achieve data transformation by way of data, and really to change the economic and industrial model. And that's why we actually sit within the Ministry of Economics. We're not within the Ministry of Public Administration. We look to obviously be competitive at a European and international level. And what we found very quickly is that there was a lot of people that had actually worked on this before, but things were not necessarily complementary. And so we've been working on a large puzzle to try to make it practical for SMEs and even public administrations, even large companies to some extent, to try to capitalize on the work that has been done. And then on the next slide, you can actually see much better, obviously it's an oversimplified model. What is it we're really trying to do? Well, you can imagine what we're trying to do is really foster the data economy, but also along the lines of data sovereignty or strategic data autonomy, as sometimes people call it these days. And so we really are trying to build sovereign federated data ecosystems. And there's 4 pillars that we see in building the sovereign federated ecosystems, Well, first of all, because they're federated and they're ecosystems, you need a sense of community. The idea of being federated means you're not putting all the data in a single place, rather it's about communications and interconnection. So the element of transparency and trust plays a major role, because you're not going to share something or work with someone you don't actually trust. And for the first element of trust is to have a certain amount of transparency of what's going on. Innovation obviously is an important pillar, because ultimately these are instruments to be able to really innovate and really push forward this data economy for growth, for competitiveness, for better living of citizens and organizations. And then we didn't want to forget the pillar of scaling up, because a lot of times, and I come from the technological world, it's quite tempting to do a proof of concept, but if it doesn't scale up, then it doesn't really provide us much value. And so underneath all these pillars, and this is really the work that we do from the National Data Office, is really this idea of pushing for a cross-sectoral, common infrastructure. And this infrastructure is not just technological, it's also soft law, or standards, and really it's about merging cloud, data, and AI. I tend to think of cloud as Moore's law, the idea of computing, data as I forgot the name now, but there's a law for how the power of networks grows exponentially as more people get into the network. And then AI obviously is a combination where you're usually using data and the availability of data with computing architectures that are quite innovative, vis-a-vis graphical processing units or whatever it is that comes next with tensor processing units. And so you can really see here that, from the base layer of a sort of a common semantics or infrastructure, or actually hardware, you go up in the digitalization value chain all the way to your value at the top, with data economy and doing it in a way that it respects the digital autonomy. The next slide is actually very similar to this, but it's a lot more technical. I'm not going to get into all the details, but really what I want to show you here is the idea of interconnecting data domains, or projects, and those are those vertical lines with the ecosystems, and we tend to think very layer wise. And so we think about a business layer where we really are able to interconnect those ecosystems. This is an older slide, so it's missing the interconnection between the ecosystems, but there should be some arrows there. And really that's the ability to relate at a business level and be able to generate social value, economic value. But underneath that, really you have this idea of data spaces, It's ecosystems of data. And like I said, it's not just data sets, but it's data services, That includes models, semantics, algorithms. But notice there in the little icon, you even have computation, infrastructure as service, platform as service, And the idea is that, and here you can actually see the arrows of players under a single ecosystem at the data and services layer, being able to interconnect with others, this is the concept underpinning the European value of the European concept of data space. You know, it's not a physical infrastructure; it's a network of people connecting by way of what? Well, by way of two things: of federation, meaning the actual technical capability to interconnect systems. There's not a lot of work in this. This is quite recent. You know, there's it's hard to see there, but there's a little icon there to GXFS. That's a Federation service. It's a stack of Gaia X. It exists. It's real, but I don't think it's being used in production yet. This is probably, I think it was passed to the open source community maybe 2 months ago. So it's still quite nascent, and it's not a full stack anyway. This is the ability to interconnect with verified credential wallets. It's a lot of Web 3.0 terminology, but it's real. You know, you're able to decentralize your identity and be able to that way really connect with the data and services layer on top, and make that service and data and services layer identity be interoperable within different ecosystems. And underneath that, you can see the actual trust framework, which is, well, nothing but a fancy name for some sort of architectural conceptualization for how you actually generate that that registration and that transparency that really underpins trust. And this is the same thing that I had on the layer above, but a little more technical. So this is all the great news, but the next slide starts with the bad news. Or not, depends how you look at it. This is a very recent document that it's actually done by Citra. It's an innovation fund from Finland, from the Finnish parliament. And they publish a lot of things on data and fair data sharing. So this is nothing but a little diagram that shows how complex the governance scheme is for data spaces. They took the example of Spain and Finland. Obviously, this could generalize to any other country. But you can see there, different in the legend, the different levels that you already have. You have in the blue European level, and again, this is just taking into account the European domain. Of course, if you include international, then it gets even more complicated. And you have various entities and bodies that are working on the governance, but also at the member state level, you have coordination bodies. That one in Spain, top right, that's us, at the Spanish National Data Office. But you also have at the actual project level, a data space level, that is actually trying to, in some ways, those data space levels are those data collabs that, for example, our Colombian colleague was commenting. You know, that's a particular project. Because what does it try to do from Spain? Well, we're not trying to actually run projects themselves from my office. That's why we don't have data. We're trying to provide some kind of common rules so that people can run projects and do it in a way that is interconnected with the different projects. And not just with the projects, with the European bodies, with the member state authorities, you know, and all this very nascent but very active community of organizations and projects. And my next slide, which is the last one, it's essentially the same idea of different levels of governance, you know, because it's so complex. We try to kind of put it in a little more simplified way. And by the way, at the bottom, you actually have that Citra paper that was published just last week. Really, we define three different levels, but one has a caveat, which is the regulatory aspect. So at the very top, you see all these. For those of you in Latin America might not be aware, the European Union has been passing quite a lot of digital laws in this commission, as in von der Leyen's commission. So the laws have been passed, but they need to gain market traction, you know. And of course, the next commission, which will be next year, needs to ensure the compliance. And this is a key element because it's not so easy to understand and they're quite difficult, you know. And then obviously those laws already come with a lot of European level bodies, you know, how to ensure that data sharing governance will deliver the expected results. Stefan mentioned this to some extent as well. And here you have at least 3 different subcategories. Strategy, you know, the Directorate Generals at the European Commission level, they really push for the specific strategies and policies within a given sector. At supervisory level, you have the Data Protection Board. There's a bit of a typo there. It should say EDPB, European Data Protection Board. But you also have competence authorities, because when you're sharing data, suddenly you're saying, well, how do I make sure I'm not creating cartels? You have the European Data Innovation Board. I mean, some of these have not been actually created yet. you know, like the DIP is in the process of getting created. ENISA is our cybersecurity agency, but even at the execution and support level, you have these legal frameworks called EDICs, European Digital Infrastructure Consortiums, which is nothing but a legal framework for multi-country projects, you know. Projects like the Data Spaces Support Center, public tenders like Simple, which is 150 million euros to actually develop the technology for interconnecting a bunch of those data spaces. Of course, when you go a level down to the member state level, you know, this is, for example, where we work from Argentina Española, but you also have the public policy at the member state level. You also have the supervisory elements that, you know, there's not just a European Data Protection Board, but a Spanish Data Protection Agency. There's also a competent authority in every single member state. And you also have the investment, you know, with the next generation EU funds, there's been quite a lot of investments. And we're really pushing some ourselves from our side, from the office. You know, a significant amount of money. How do we make sure that we're not creating little cathedrals, as the French tend to say? You know, how we're not actually creating more silos than we're meant to break. And of course, those projects are at the bottom. They're the data space initiatives, and ultimately, this is critical. You know, there's a lot of discussion in Europe whether this should be a top-down strategy or a bottom-up. The reality, I think, is you need to combine both, because the European laws have been generated, but the European laws are not going to create any projects. The projects are created by the data space initiatives, data collab initiatives. How do you specify the governance model that actually works for the players in sharing the data? You know, and there's actually quite a lot of experimentation having been done in Horizon programs and a bunch of other funding programs from the European Commission. But they are definitely little cathedrals. So, you know, part of the work that I've been trying to push very recently is to try to understand whether there's a need for some sort of data space coordination at the European level, because I don't know if the best way is an agency, PPP, joint undertaking. I mean, these are all very technical terms for European folks, but clearly there is a very complex structure, and I think like the guide that's presented today is actually very, very useful as a sort of a technical instrument to actually provide. But I think if we really want to get the power of data, we need to break the silos. And the only way to break the silos is to have proper coordination. And so we are actually promoting this idea of data space coordination within industries, member states, but definitely European level. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Alberto, por tu presentación. Es realmente interesante y complejo ver la magnitud de la estructura de gobernanza alrededor de la gestión de los datos en la Unión Europea, pero también resulta bastante provechoso entender cómo, desde tu perspectiva, esta herramienta sí que aporta una solución en términos de la identificación de las mejores prácticas y esta metodología y este enfoque que los gobiernos podrían seguir para fomentar los flujos de datos bajo sus propias realidades. Following with these presentations, now I'd like to introduce you to Fraser McDonald. Fraser is Deputy Director at the Data for Children Collaborative and specializes in using cross-sector collaboration to solve complex problems. He has worked across the UK and international research communities, designing and managing transformational projects for the public, private, and third sectors. As Deputy Director at the Data for Children Collaborative, Fraser creates novel methodologies that enable transdisciplinary collaboration, data-driven innovation, and end-to-end impact evaluation. Thank you very much, Fraser, for attending this webinar. We cannot wait to hear from you about data collaborations with the third and public sectors.
Perfect. Thanks very much, and thanks so much for inviting me along today. And it's been great to hear some really interesting talks so far, and I'm looking forward to discussion later. Yeah, so I'm here from Data for Children Collaborative, and we're really focusing on how you work with third and public sectors to really address some of the big global issues. Who we are an organisation based at Edinburgh University Edinburgh Futures Institute, and we were born out of an original collaboration between Scottish Government, UNICEF, and Edinburgh University. And our primary focus when that was initially set up was really to be dedicated to using data responsibly to improve outcomes for every child. And I reflect a little bit on the conversations earlier and Stefan's great introduction to the guide about where we sit on that spectrum of data collaboratives. And I really see us kind of looking at, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, about the partnership side of it and how you establish good and effective partnerships who can work together, work with data, and to deliver outcomes. So what we do practically on the ground, we help partners. We bring in a whole range of partners, UNICEF being one of them, but we work with many others to help them solve child-centric issues using data-driven solutions. We look at the really complex problems that really need collaboration, working together, pulling in different data to unpick and unravel and come up with novel solutions that are going to address that. To do that, we create the best conditions for combining data and expertise, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. And I think it's really important to always reflect on how you create those conditions that allow different individuals to come together. And then last but not least, we build innovative methods to do that. We build systematic approaches, methodologies that allow us to be challenge-led and collaborate across all sectors, academia, private, public, and third. We at Data for Children Collaborative work across a number of themes. These themes have been agreed by our partners and us, so the various organisations that help us on our advisory group, as well as our kind of core partners, helped us look at, right, well, what are the main areas that you need to think about and look at in terms of children's issues, and can we start to focus our efforts in those areas? So there are 8 priority ones. There are education, population, mental health, nutrition, public health responses, which was really born out of our response to COVID and in the evolution of that thinking, poverty, climate change, and then we have an ad hoc one there because we do have a lot of projects that possibly don't quite fit one of them, but are still core and important for us to consider. Now, this is something I want to think about quite a lot, because I think we, to enable us to build these data collaborations and to build these partnerships, it's really core for us to think about being challenge-led. And that is, you know, I think, again, back to the original guide and this idea of how do you define the problem? How do you do that in an effective way? And this is the approach that we take. We work with a variety of partners to look at the wider need across those thematic areas. We dial that down to specific issues. From that, we can then start to determine, right, what is an example problem that we can look to address? What within that are the problems that require a data-driven solution? And I'll touch on the governance approach to establishing and prioritizing that later on in this presentation. We then need to think about what are the barriers that are going to address that. Now, that can be data barriers. Are there restrictions to data access? Are there expertise gaps? Are there knowledge gaps? And are there research gaps? And once we've established what those barriers are to addressing that problem, we can then think about the resources we need to plug those gaps. And the resources and identifying and bringing in those resources is really what I'm going to talk about in terms of the work that we've been doing over the past 4 years in building up systematic approaches to pulling in those right resources to address those problems. And then from that, we can establish our project. And we have a wide number of projects. I think on the last count, we've got about, I think it's 17, 18 projects running globally, really looking at core issues facing children and wide global partnerships to address those. So really, it's being challenge-led and thinking about those outcomes to meet those challenges. And then how do you do it? So how can you bring in and establish various expertise to address those problems? And we've developed an approach that we call impact collaborations. There are loads of examples of those on our website, which are very much challenge-led problems that we go out to a wide audience and we bring in expertise. Now, when I say expertise, I want and I look for expertise across all sectors. For us to solve these truly complex problems facing children, we need a wide range of perspectives in the room. This systematic approach of putting out an expression of interest, bringing in the expertise, and then co-designing that project through a design thinking approach allows us to build these really effective collaborations. But then what we always have to consider in our work is how we work together. How do we do that? Now, when you start to bring in academics, third sector, public sector, private sector, all in one place, bringing in their perspectives and their expertise to a problem, you need to make sure that they are acting and behaving in a way that is collaborative, that is appropriate, and that is conscious of the problem that you are working with. And you have to make sure you can do that in a systematic way for all your projects. So over time, we have built what we call our responsible innovation framework. It is effectively a series of steps and tools that we apply to all our projects, which really enriches them. And it gives all our teams the necessary training and awareness so that they can innovate responsibly. And I won't go through every single one. I don't think we have time for that, but I'll go through some of them. So that prioritization framework really touches on that original statement I made about how you decide and identify the right challenges. And that's a series of kind of scoring mechanisms we use for that. Legals at a Glance is a really important tool for us. We often bring together all these various collaborations of various organizations who don't all fully understand the collaborative agreement that their legal teams have signed up to. So we have a very simple approach to addressing that issue and making sure that everyone is aware of what they are signed up to in their team and in their project. All our teams undergo safeguarding training. It's incredibly important for us to do that as they are working issues facing children. We have ethics assessment, which is a 3-stage process specific to data and children, and how these teams can really look at how a project evolves through time, because they often do, and what are some of the ethical implications around that. And then we also have youth participation impact statements. So how do you engage young people? Should you engage young people in your work? And then how do you evaluate the impact of that? All the documents and all the tools are all freely available online on our website. And I want to very quickly touch upon an example of all of this in practice. So this is a project we did with UNICEF. They came to us with the broad issue of where are children most vulnerable to the impact of climate change, both now and in the future. And it's really the in the future bit that they were really challenged with. They didn't have the internal expertise to look at the data, all the massive data that we have accessible to us around climate change and climate impacts. And they wanted to essentially look at how you combine understanding of hazards with vulnerability to build a risk index for children. So we worked with them to break that down, do an impact collaboration, and bring together a truly multidisciplinary team across, we've got obviously University of Southampton, Edinburgh, Stirling, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and also University of Highlands and Islands, who worked from looking at the statistical approaches to geospatial, to geophysical, to social sciences, to help them build what became the Children's Climate Risk Index. And that index, which was an example of up in the top right, got brought forward and used in COP in Glasgow, which effectively provided the background evidence and advocacy tool for a lot of countries to advocate for change. Beyond that, as we look to project it into the future, that second ask of theirs, we then were able to identify the challenges that face our world around heat waves and how heat waves are going to impact pretty much every child in the world. And that got brought forward to Egypt and allowed a lot of countries to start talking about policy shifts. So that's an incredibly impactful piece of work, an incredibly impactful collaboration that continues to work on this problem. And then last but not least, I think it's important for us to talk about this. There's a lot of thinking I'm doing at the moment at Data for Children is around the value of collaboration. We talk about let's collaborate, it's important to collaborate, we should all work together, but we should really think about where is the value exchange in collaborations and how important is it? And this is a kind of very simple graphic I use to explain this, that obviously for us, we talk about the impact on children as core to everything we do. We talk about the impact of the outputs for the challenge owner, UNICEF, for example. But then what important we have to think about is the collaborators. When we bring together various partners, they learn, they develop, they engage in new ways, and they gain value from being in collaborations. And it's important for us to communicate that effectively when we start to build these partnerships, is that they will gain value from this beyond the core output that we're looking to do. And then obviously us, we gain value from learning how to iterate and develop and become better at what we do and how we build these collaborations. So I think it's important to summarize here so we can carry on with the conversation. Key messages for us is that collaborative working, interdisciplinary working does work. We can deliver really good data collaboratives that can really do impactful things. Bringing in different expertise is core to this. It's important that we appreciate different perspectives. And our role as a data collaborative is that we hold responsibility for ensuring that they stay on focus, they deliver the impact that is necessary, and that they consider the challenge-led approach that we're taking here. And last but not least, collaborating is core to us addressing these sustainable development goals, which are core to everything that we do. And on that, I'll close there because I appreciate we want to get on to the discussion. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Fraser. Thank you for your presentation. I just want to continuar ahora, dar la palabra a Julia Díaz, quien es consultora en innovación digital y lidera las iniciativas de código para el desarrollo y Data Partnership en el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Además de promover la adopción de código y datos abiertos en América Latina y el Caribe, Julia también se especializa en innovación, con énfasis en innovación abierta o en el desarrollo de herramientas digitales que utilizan tecnologías disruptivas para mejorar el diseño y ejecución de políticas públicas. Julia tiene más de 10 años de experiencia en organizaciones multilaterales y de impacto social en la región. Es ingeniera industrial por la Unicamp y cuenta con una maestría en Administración Pública de Columbia University. Julia, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Queremos escuchar ahora a través de tu presentación qué es el Development Data Partnership. Adelante.
Thank you so much, Fabricio. Let me just share my screen. Can you all see it? Yes. Perfect. So I wanted to share a little bit with you what we're doing here at the IDB in terms of data collaboratives. So the Development Data Partnership is a consortium among international development organizations, and we focus on basically making it easier for tech companies to share their proprietary data with us for development efforts, being the publication on knowledge on the countries that we are supporting, being data directly related to the projects that we are doing with governments. So why the Development Data Partnership? We all know that, you know, for us and for the governments that we support, to design and implement better policy, we need better data. And a lot of this better data is proprietary data that is within private tech companies. And tech companies, they are willing, they want to share their proprietary data with us for development efforts. And when I say with us, it's, you know, all these development organizations that you see on the screen, the IDB, the IMF, the World Bank, OECD, UNDP, the European Bank, the Asian Development Bank, CAF, and, you know, we're growing bigger as a consortium of development organizations. And the idea here was we need proprietary data in order to do better policy. Tech companies are willing to share their data with us for free with no cost, but we have to have a low transaction cost. Our goal here is to significantly reduce the transaction costs associated with data sharing for those companies. So they're willing to share their data with us. And I wanted to share a little bit of how it works. So we have a common legal foundation, a common data agreement with all development organizations. So when a development organization approaches tech company and they agree on the master data agreement that they're going to sign, all the other development organizations can sign the same data agreement. We have one unified marketplace, one unified data governance. So we have one platform where all staff from all development partners can see what data partners work with us, see the data sets that they have available. They can submit a proposal of a project, of a need that they have, that they need the data for solving. They can get the necessary approvals to access this data through the platform. They sign all the terms of agreement through the platform, and the data is shared in the same way for all development partners with the proper IT security. And I also, I think it's worth going through this from the tech side, the tech company side, what's their experience. So they sign one data license agreement with, well, they sign a lot of data license agreements that are all the same with all the development partners. They can access and evaluate all the proposals from all these development partners in one place. So they have one place where they know exactly what problems, what proposals are coming from us, and they accept or reject at the same place. Upon approval, they share their data exact the same way for us, for OCD, for UNDP. It's exactly the same experience for them. And we keep them on the loop with everything, that all the results that we are reaching with their data. And we have we have Slack channels with them where we're all, development organizations and data organizations together. So we find it easier ways to communicate. And here are our current partners. So we have LinkedIn, we have Waze, Vetaset, Esri, GitHub, Google, and those companies are all sharing their proprietary data. They're all non-personal data, so we don't work with personal data, but they're sharing their data without any cost with development organizations. And just so you, I just wanted to make you visualize a little bit of the development data partnership is. So this is the platform that we have. Any staff from any development organization that is part of the consortium can go into this platform, see all the data partners that we have available. They can explore the data sets that are available for each data partner that we have. And they can submit a formal proposal that includes the problem that they want to solve, how they're going to solve, how they're going to use the data, the methodology, the team. They can, on this proposal, they can add more than one data partner. So if you want to analyze mobility patterns of places that don't have internet access, you're gonna add Ookla and you're gonna add Vetaset to the same proposal, and they're each gonna receive and approve, and you're gonna see it at the same place. And once, I think it's worth showing this a little. It's a lot of information here, but it's worth showing because this is the trajectory that they are doing. So a staff submit a proposal through the form that I just showed. It goes through internal proposal review. So I'm gonna review it, I'm gonna approve, or I'm gonna ask them to explain something a little bit better. Once it's approved, our data partner is gonna receive the proposal. They can reject or they can approve. Once they approve the terms, the staff that asks for the data is going to receive an email saying that they have to agree with the terms. They're going to go to the same platform, agree to the terms, access the data. The data can be accessed through 4 different channels. The first one is SharePoint. The second one is just the partner shares a login and password to that portal. The third one is through an API. And the fourth one is through Amazon Cloud folder, just because some of the data sets are really large. So it's just easier to do through Amazon. Once the project is completed, we can revoke their access or destroy the data, depending on the type of access. Before publishing the results, the staff shared the results and how the data was used with the data partner. A lot of times the data partner even adds a few insights to what we've developed. And we publish together with the data partner what we have been working on. And here are a few examples of what has been published. So we do a lot with LinkedIn, analyzing, trends, COVID trends, gender inclusion, specific skills for specific industries. We do a lot with mobility. So this specific study, I think it was for the city of Buenos Aires. It was meant to help the government to improve the public transportation using the mobility data of their citizens. And we also submit a lot of projects and use this data for internal projects that we have. So for example, we just used data on flooding to prioritize informal settlements that we were going to support, given their risk of flooding in one specific city in Latin America. So this is a little bit how we are, creating the proper governance, facilitating the private companies to share their proprietary data for development, and creating and helping governments with technical support and insights based on this proprietary data that many times governments don't have access. And I think if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I would love to also leave time for discussion.
Muchísimas gracias, Julia, por mostrarnos esta importante herramienta. No podemos cerrar. Yo, antes de concluir esta sesión, quiero agradecer a las más de 160 personas que tuvimos conectadas durante toda esta jornada. Y como no podría ser de otra manera, quiero invitar a la autora de la guía que nos convoca esta mañana para que nos pueda brindar sus closing remarks sobre la sesión. Natalia, bienvenida y gracias a todos.
Gracias, Fabricio. Va a pasar a inglés porque los panelistas todos hablan en inglés. Pero thank you very much, everyone, to be part of this event, to be working with us and sharing with us your experiences and your specific use cases and how we can build on the collaboration. So I mean, we didn't have time for discussion, but I would like to have to bring an overview of what you shared. I mean, it was exciting to hear from different perspectives, different sectors, and different ways to use the data and share the data for specific problems or needs that each city or country has, or organization even, right? So it was great to hear from Bogota their operational approach that we also discussed during the what Estefan discussed in the presentation, how they managed to follow the steps and I mean, understand the supply and demand of data and understand what were the actors they needed to have in the table to kind of match both the supply and demand. It was great to also hear from Spain from a more governance approach and perspective. And also great to hear from Data for Children Collaborative, Fraser, on how you follow this methodological approach and how you can and how you have done systematic and more build a framework approach to kind of provide the solutions you are bringing. And finally, it was great to hear from Julia how we can build our international organizations are building a data culture around the data they own, and how it can help for different stakeholders, not only international organizations, but also governments and different actors to use the data in order to have a better decision-making process. So thank you so much. I think it resonates a lot with the guide we have built. And just to close, we are eager to work with you all in implement if needed. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos durante esta jornada. Que tengan un excelente día. Hasta pronto.
Gracias a todos.